All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Neal Hulkower. We're at the Nicholson Library at Linfield College. It's November 7th, 2019. Thanks so much for joining us today, Neal. We appreciate this. Let's start with the most important question, which is why wine?
Well, my exposure to wine goes all the way back to my childhood, where for religious purposes we had a lot of Manischewitz, for kiddush and bar mitzvahs and all that kind of stuff. It was pretty sweet. It wasn't particularly palatable, but it was regular. I mean, we had it once a week. My father once or twice would bring in the dry Concord version of it, which I found to be less annoying. It wasn't until 1968 that I had my first exposure to fine wine. It's a long story in and of itself, but basically I was rooming for a month with a fellow astronomy major at Northwestern while I was waiting for the dorms to open, and we were both underage. I was 19, he was 18, and I go into his apartment and he has a bottle of Leo Villascas and Calon Segur. At some point that neither of us can remember precisely, one of those bottles was opened, and that changed my life. I mean, that became something that I just simply had. I have a really good sense of smell, even now, 50 plus years later, and I derive a lot of pleasure simply from smelling a beautifully made wine. Fortunately, these days I do it daily, and so it's become a backdrop. Over the years, I mean, we formed a little gourmet society in when I was a grad student and old enough to buy my own stuff, and we would have wine tastings. Some of those tastings were documented in the form of notes that I compiled and actually published. So my first publication in wine was in Vintage Magazine in 1973-74. That magazine doesn't exist anymore, and I have 2 issues, but I know I've had notes in others, and I'd like to try to find them if I can. But in grad school, I mean, since I was a grad student, plus I had a family, plus I was teaching part-time to support myself. We didn't do wine every day, but it was a regular thing for me. And I like to say that I floated to my PhD on a river of French and German wine of rather high quality, because back then it wasn't expensive. You're not talking like you can now. It actually became a major influence in what I ended up doing, which is very strange. When I finished grad school, I went to take a tenure track position at Vanderbilt in the math department, and didn't make enough money to support my wine habit. So after a year and a half, I decided that I needed to get out of Nashville, and went into industry, as it were, in California, which of course put me into a whole wine area. So I was at Jet Propulsion Lab and in Southern California, and then I had access to some pretty good hooch that I took advantage of on a regular basis. At Vanderbilt, my office mate had been at Caltech, and before I took off, he took off at the same time I did. He gave me a stack of Trader Joe's flyers from back in the day, and so I had to make a beeline to Trader Joe's and take advantage of that scene. So that sort of got me more and more deeply involved as a consumer, not yet in any way, shape, or form involved as either a volunteer or writer or anything else. And over time, I mean, my wine collection built up, and we also moved around. I went from California to Massachusetts, back to the East Coast, and there, of course, you get access to all the European stuff. Before I left California, I'd actually been exposed to Oregon wine from a Trader Joe's bargain bin. They had gotten 3 vintages of a winery that went under, the name of which I can't remember. I thought it had something to do with Thomas, but it's not Thomas that exists now. They were selling $18 bottles of Oregon Pinot for $1.98. So I figured I'd pick up a couple of bottles, and if I liked them, I'd go back. So I went back, and they were gone. They were history. But I had the bug. I mean, I was a Burgundy fan from before. California Pinots, and some were pretty good, but they weren't Burgundies. Oregon, on the other hand, Oregon. So in Massachusetts, I could find Oregon wines. I could get Burgundies. I could get all kinds of stuff. After Massachusetts, I moved to Washington State, and there I'm in a different region, and of course now drinking Syrahs and Cabs, but I'm still close to Oregon, and I can get some Pinot Noir. It's great. It was my first exposure to actually volunteering at a winery. I helped out with a crush at Betts in Woodinville when he had a little garage in the industrial park over there. I did that a couple of times, and I actually started working retail part-time when my gig in Washington went south, and before we moved to Virginia, which is the last place I lived. So I actually worked retail and helped out with the tasting and did food pairings and all this kind of stuff. We moved to Virginia, which is also a wine area of some note, and by then my collection, had grown significantly, and again, I was working, so I didn't have a bottle of wine every night like I do now, and it was sort of a special occasion kind of thing. But wine has been a backdrop to my life, basically, for as long as I can remember, and fine wine certainly since graduate school, about 1970 on.
You joked to me the other day that when we were talking that you had your Oregon habit, you'd had to fuel your Oregon wine habit, and until you finally actually just moved to Oregon after all, so you'd had to kind of have jobs to pay for that habit all along.
Quite so.
Which I appreciate, yeah. So tell me a little bit about some of the work you were doing outside of wine. You mentioned the JPL, you mentioned graduate teaching at Vanderbilt. Tell me a little bit about your other career.
Sure. So actually I've had several sub-careers. My PhD is in applied mathematics. My dissertation was on an ancient problem called the three-body problem of celestial mechanics, which Newton first proposed. It was never solved. It's actually unsolvable in the traditional sense. And what you do is you try to describe solutions. You can't actually write them down, but you try to describe them. So in order to do that, you apply a lot of analysis, high-level mathematics. What it does is it gives you credentials to teach math. It also gives you credentials to be a rocket scientist. So I went to Jet Propulsion Lab to actually work on missions, space missions. I specialized in asteroid missions. I worked with Eleanor Helene, who discovered more asteroids up until her time than anybody else. We wrote a paper or two together. She named an asteroid after me. And I still love, it also combines astronomy, which is, what I was doing as an undergrad. And then as a grad student, it was sort of mathematical astronomy. So, the loves combined, and I was able to make enough money to afford the California wines and live rather better than a assistant professor without tenure. I moved on from there to TRW, which was an aerospace company. It was actually considered a step down because JPL was like the pinnacle but they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I became a cost analyst then, which is not cost accounting. It's building mathematical models to estimate the cost of hardware and software based on technical parameters. So that, it turns out, lacked people. And so I was able to leverage that career to first TRW, and then after a few years, MITRE Corporation, which is now back up to the federally funded research and development level, same as JPL. And that's where I spent the longest period of my career. But I get bored fairly easily. I was there 10 plus years. I was department head. I was made a department head of the Economic and Decision Analysis Center. And when I didn't get promoted to the level I thought I should, I was recruited away by a friend from JPL who started a software company in Redmond, Washington. And I eventually end up being the CEO of that. From there, things changed. I did the little gig in the wine shop. And then I went to Massachusetts, not to Massachusetts. I went from Massachusetts to Washington State. I had, by the way, in between MITRE Corporation and the software company I was in, I actually worked for a week in a wine shop in West Concord that was owned by one of my bosses at MITRE. His family, it was like a family business. So that was my first retail experience in like 1998. It was a lot of fun. So, now I'm in Washington State and taking advantage of that, helping out at Betts. And then I got an offer out in Virginia where I was an executive in a professional services company trying to help the government do the right thing. I was, at one point, vice president of SIN, Space, Intel, Navy, Army programs. That gig dried up because they were sort of running low on money. They converted me to a consultant. We had bought our place here 10 years ago, and we're starting to come out. So when I didn't need to be in Virginia anymore, we became residents, full-time residents in 2011. By then, I had already been starting to do a bit of the writing, and I gave you that copy of my first technical article on wine that was published in the Journal of Wine Research in 2009, where I combined my love of math and decision analysis, which I had gotten into, with wine, and redid the Judgment of Paris tasting, and demonstrated that if you use a mathematically more defensible method, the Haut-Brion, the 70 Haut-Brion, comes in first place and edges out the Stag's Leap. The Chateau, the California Chardonnay does persist in first place, doing it with this Borda method. We celebrated the publication of that paper by actually procuring a bottle of the 70 Haut-Brion, which turned out to be flat out terrific, even 39 plus years later. So, that was entertaining. I wrote my first popular article beyond, after the ones in the 70s, for the Oregon Wine Press, and it was kind of a golden book version of that paper. It came out in October 2011, and it's called Borda is Better. And it describes what I've done. And then since then, I've written fairly regularly for the press. I've actually had an article in the World of Fine Wines and other publications. I do regular book reviews for the Journal of Wine Economics, Journal of Wine Research, and so on. So I'm pretty active now in that, and it's a lot of fun.
What made the idea of writing about wine something that appealed to you? You didn't come from really a writing, at least a popular writing background. So what made you want to write for publications like the Wine Press?
So actually, I did do some popular writing. There's an organization when I was at JPO. JPO was a cool place, and we were encouraged to not just do our technical work, but also to reach out a bit to the public, because they funded NASA, they did everything. So I was involved in some popular writing on the asteroid missions, on asteroids. Eleanor Helene and I, Glow is her nickname, wrote a popular thing for an organization called the World Space Foundation, which is no more. It's basically started right around the same time as the Planetary Society, which still exists. I was technical editor of their issue on asteroids in like 1983. I would give popular talks on asteroid missions at various scenarios. So I was a popularizer, as it was. I also like writing. My dissertation has more symbols than words in it, but it was still deemed one of the best written dissertations in 2 years at Northwestern. So, now that may not be saying much, since mathematicians are not known for being particularly eloquent, but I tried. I mean, I have to explain things to myself, and I take that and I use that when I popularize anything. So it's really funny. Hillary Berg, who's the editor, was shocked when I first started submitting articles, because she had never known that a mathematician could write. It's like, okay, I've been doing it for a while. And the way I go about writing a piece is not that dissimilar to thinking about math, because you state a proposition, a theorem, a corollary, or something like that, and then you work out the details underneath, and then not so much formally in math do you say, okay, this is what I told you. You just basically say, QED, I'm done, But in popular writing, it's again, or in presentation, it's again where you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and tell them what you told them. In the journalism business, your first line should be the lead, right? And so you don't bury the lead, as they say. You put the lead up there. That becomes your proposition. You make your case, backing it up, and then you wrap up so that people know what you've done. I like words. I like puns. I like alliteration, and writing gives me the opportunity to do that. It's not that it's an easy thing that you can do, but it's a hell of a lot easier to come up with than coming up with a new theorem in a 300-year-old discipline that's been picked over by some pretty smart folk. So it's a way of staying mentally interested and active and so on, but still press your brain and get something out, before the next ice age.
What's unique about wine writing as compared to the other kinds of writing you've done?
Well, clearly the subject matter, which itself is broad beyond belief. There's more contacts. A lot of the stuff I do are profiles. I profiled, for example, Don Hagee because he's a fellow rocket scientist that was a natural. So you're in there interviewing people. So I had to pay attention to interview skills. If you're writing popular science stuff, you're at least expecting that your audience is going to know something. If you're writing popular wine articles, the experience base of your potential audience is much broader and may in fact not necessarily be as well informed. So you have to be respectful of that and then bring them along to the point where they they're interested to continue reading the article. So, I do that. I use big words because I look for precision and all that kind of stuff. But I also use humor and, puns and all that kind of stuff to get the audience ingrained. I write different kinds of things about wine. I do the piece like Borda is Better, where I'm trying to explain a technical article. I do reportage in the form of, opening a new tasting room or somebody's celebrating an anniversary. Hillary sent me off to do the first weed and wine tour after, maybe she thought because I was around in the 60s that was a thing that I would be interested in, but, I don't do weed. I had and still can have security clearances, just, nope. But it was fun. So I do that kind of stuff. And the articles, some articles write themselves. That one kind of did, because it was a flow. You were picked up, you went to a weed shop, you went to a winery, you left. That one's pretty easy. But then some you have to kind of mold and create yourself. I quite honestly prefer the latter because it does keep the brain going. I do all because I like doing Hillary a favor when she asks me, because she publishes my stuff. And I also am open to surprises. You never know. You just never know what you're going to run into. I still write technical articles. I had an article come out this year called The Power of None. That's voting theory, but it actually has application in wine tasting. It's an open source article. You can find it. It came out in Sage Open. It has applications in ranking wines. And I gave a talk. I'm a member of the American Association of Wine Economists, which gives me a chance to travel to different wine regions. The meetings are held all over the world. And I give talks at their annual meetings. And I did one called How to Decide, which is chiding them to some extent on using mathematically indefensible methods for aggregating preferences and showing them how to do it right, And this Power of None actually references an application of that, and vice versa. In the presentation, I cite that as it was submitted. It hadn't been published yet. So I look for that connection. I think that's a comparative advantage I have in writing about wine. Is I'm a mathematician. I love math. I love explaining math. I love wine. I love explaining wine. It's kind of a nice marriage there.
Have you found certain topics or certain types of stories that are, you mentioned you like the ones that are challenging and that don't write themselves.
Yeah.
Are there certain topics you look for? Are there certain articles, opportunities you jump at?
Yes and no. There is an article that I would like to do someday that I just haven't gotten around to. It'll take some effort. There was a marvelous article written by Jamie Good in the World of Fine Wines in 2012 on whole cluster fermentation in Burgundy. It's a brilliant, fabulous piece. And it focuses, as I said, in France. So in addition to what I do here, I work in tasting rooms, and up until the end of last year, I worked at White Rose, which specializes in whole cluster fermentation. I was a dear friend of Jesús Guillén, who also has a label that does whole cluster fermentation. And I love it. To me, it's neither, to use a mathematical terminology, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to make great Pinot Noir. but it does make great Pinot Noir. And when it does, it's different. You know, it's more savory. The structure is interesting, and so on. So I'd really like to do almost an Oregon companion piece to Jamie Good's, but it would require me, you know, setting up appointments and going around and interviewing, and not that that would be a bad thing, but you know, but it's you know, I'd have to try to be distinctive, because I mean his article is so good, brings up all the arguments for and against and so on. So that would be a challenge, to sort of say something new, say something relevant. So we'll see what happens with that.
As you kind of look at the things you've written, especially relating to wine, do you have any favorite topics or favorite stories you wrote that you're especially proud of?
There's probably 5 or so that I cite to people. The Borda is Better article, because it's my first one and my first attempt at cleaning things up. I have one called kaleidolfactic, which is a term I coined to describe a wine that changes in smell. You know, it's a cross between kaleidoscope, you know, that word, and then olfactory, your nose. And I have a parody of a tasting note in there that I think is still pretty funny when I go back and read it. I like that one a lot. There's one called A Chosen None. I get a lot of ideas, many of which I don't follow up on, from my experience in the tasting room. And people really love to ask you, what's your favorite wine? And this is the answer to that. At White Rose, I was able to pop it up on our pad and say, here, read, you know. So I like that one a whole lot. There's one really interesting one called Clash of Sensibilities, and it's where wine and math conflict. There was an article written that actually Greg Jones was a co-author on with 3 fellows from Portugal, where they were looking at ways of maybe, they were rank ordering vintages, Portuguese vintages, and aggregating based on some parameters or something like that. And they used something called Condorcet, and I said, you know, Condorcet is flawed. And so I wrote to the Journal of Wine Economics, I wrote a comment on it saying, no, you shouldn't use Condorcet, use Borda, and this is what you get when you use Borda. And they published it, and then I guess the protocol is that they get to respond. So they responded, and they went, no, you still use Condorcet. Well, I was done, because you can't then respond to that. So I decided that I was going to take it to the streets and write for the Oregon Wine Press. So that's what Clash of Sensibility is all about. And instead of doing it for Portuguese wines, I used their method. I used their idea with the board account to come up with a ranking of Oregon vintages, and like 2000s. What they did is they got the rankings from, they got rankings from, I don't know, half a dozen or so different wine critics, and then they aggregated them using Condorcet. I aggregated them using Borda, and I got a ranking, and I looked at the results and I go, no, they're stupid. And so the math was done right, the results were ridiculous. So I had fun with that, and if you wanted to see an example of where you know, it's an article that I'm pretty much the only one who could have written, because it's got the decision analysis, voting theory stuff, and the wine. You know, there aren't too many folks out there who care about both to the extent that I do. So that's a nice one. One that's made, pun intended, quite a splash is one called Grape Expectorations, about spitting. And
I remember reading that one.
Yeah, it's not one of my favorites, although I think it's awfully good. But my colleague in the tasting room at White Rose would show it to everybody. So it developed a bit of a fan club over there. So that, that's kind of a rundown of some of my personal preferred ones. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the audience, especially as we'll talk about your work in the tasting room here in a second, but especially as you're out in the world of wine, you're a part of the industry in a way, and you're writing for this audience that you may run into. What has the feedback been like? What is the readership like?
I'm shocked. I was once covering the Oregon Wine Symposium for Hillary, needed somebody, so I did that. And you wear your name tags and stuff. And I'm running up in the elevator, and a gentleman's in there and sees my name, and he's showering me in compliments, and it's like a little embarrassing, but because I didn't even think, I knew people read my stuff because I made them, like my family. I said, you will read this, but I didn't think anybody else did. And actually, the response I've been getting has been very positive. I do have a little distribution list that I send things out to, with maybe 100 or so names, and I get feedback, immediate feedback from those folks. Sometimes I just sent out 2 book reviews that I did that just came out in the Journal of Wine Economics. One of them is on Maltman's book called Vineyards, Rocks, and Soils, and it's a guide to geology. He's the person who kind of debunks the notion that there's minerals in wine. It's also the foundation of Are There Rocks in My Wine that I wrote a couple of months ago. That one's gotten some positive feedback already. So that, it's nice. It keeps you going. Truth be told, when I sit down to write, I do it for myself. It's nice to have an audience. I certainly don't avoid having an audience. I'm flattered and even a bit embarrassed about the praise I get, but I write for myself because it's fun. And I'm at an age now where you don't remember the last thing you did. So if you go back and read a piece from months or years ago, it's like fresh. And you go, hey, that's pretty good. You done good, kid. So that's fun. That's a lot of fun. But yeah, I'm getting more invitations to, to go to events, to cover things. I'm certainly now considered part of the Oregon wine media, which is nice. It's great. Yeah.
In addition to that, you mentioned your work at White Rose and now at Chehalem.
Chehalem,
Tell me about that part of the industry and kind of dipping your toe into the customer service side of things.
So I had the experience in retail from the 2 shops that I work with. And when I moved here, we looked around to figure out where precisely in this area we'd settle. I knew I needed to be close enough to wineries because I knew I wanted to work in tasting rooms, part-time. I'm an applied mathematician, which means, you got to get your hands dirty in some real thing. I love pure math, but math blossoms for me when it's applied to something. Similarly, if I'm going to go and write about something, I have to get my hands dirty in some sense. So I volunteered at wineries. I still do from time to time. And I also love to talk about wine, as you can tell in this interview. And so an opportunity to get out of the house, talk about wine, be part of the industry, is to work in the tasting room. And I particularly enjoy engaging with folks. And then you get all kinds of folks. I worked at White Rose over 6 years, and I'd get professors in there, and then we start talking math, which they don't expect to do with a guy on the other side of the tasting room bar. And out comes the napkins and the pen, and you're scribbling and giving them stuff, and that's fun. And in between, you're pouring and gabbing about the wine and talking about where it comes from and all that. And the day goes by, and once in a while you pick up an idea for an article, like when they keep asking me what's your favorite wine, you know. So that's kind of nice. You also, when you work at a tasting room like I did with White Rose, when you're at the winery, you're in where the action is. And like I said, I was dear friends with Jesus. His brother was tasting room manager. And, you know, I'd go down, I'd do barrel tastings, I'd, you know, get the latest, I'd walk the vineyards, I'd taste the grapes. Again, all of this, I think, gives me background which lends gravitas to my opinions in writing, more so than if I just sat in another city where there were no vineyards and no wineries, and I made things up from whole cloth, you know. You know, when I write and say something, it's because I've seen it, tasted it, felt it, heard it, experienced it, and that's very important. That's the applied aspect, you know.
And now you're working with Chehalem. Tell me about the differences now that you're not a White Rose anymore. How is it different? How is it the same?
So I love them both, and the Chehalem experience is urban, right? I'm not at the winery, although I'm one of the people trained to do tastings at the winery should they come about. But you know, I've done that once, but I've only been there less than a year now. So it's urban. You don't have the ability to say, you know, to walk somebody outside and say, that's where your wine came from. Instead, it's 2.5 miles down the road, or you know, 10 miles the other way, or whatever. If you've been to the White Rose tasting room, it's an attic, so it's dark. Chehalem tasting room has windows and indoor plumbing, which is good. They have white wines. They do more than Pinot Noir, so it gives me a broader palette to talk about. There's some spectacular bottlings and some very friendly price-wise and consumption-wise, you know, things that you can drink younger. It's a different clientele that's pitched to. There's some overlap. There's some luxury, you know, price, single vintage, reserve type wines, but a whole lot that are more popularly priced, whereas White Rose, of course, more premium, luxury level stuff. Chehalem's winemaking approach is different. They don't do whole cluster fermentation. They both represent vineyards in Oregon that I'm particularly fond of. White Rose for one, and Ridgecrest for the other. I think those are both, you know, truly wonderful vineyards in Oregon. You know, I never sat down and counted, but there's a handful that stand out to me. You know, Montazi, Temperance Hill, you know, that quality. So if I have to work in a tasting room, it will be a tasting room where they get wines from one of those vineyards that I really like. You know, it makes a difference.
Sure.
I have to be able to honestly sell.
Yeah, makes sense. You mentioned Jesus a couple of times.
Yeah.
It was kind of one of the rising stars of Oregon wine, of course, and you had an interesting relationship, or a close relationship with him. Tell me a little bit about meeting him and watching him kind of grow up in the industry, and then about losing him last year.
Yeah, so I first met Jesus in 2010. He was pouring White Rose wines at an event called Trilogy, which I think went for maybe a year or two and then went poof. And that must have been the first time I had White Rose wines, because it was either then or at Thistle when they had a 2007 or something. And then when I started working at White Rose with his brother, and he had, that was in 2012, so he had become the winemaker in 2008. Right before I started at White Rose, the Portland Monthly had ranked two White Rose 2010s, number 1 and 2 Pinots that they had tasted, and he made them. Okay, and they were great. I still have one bottle of the number one, the Dundee Hills, which was a precursor to what they now call the neoclassical objective. As so many winemakers around here do, he struck me as really bright. I mean, just really an intelligent guy. Had the computer background, but just warm, friendly, great guy. He was starting to push his own label, Guillén Family Wines, and then we became friends. I mean, he'd come over for dinner. He liked my writing. He was a fan, and in fact asked me to write that article last year on what became AHIVOY. Had no name at that time, so that was my first cover story at the Oregon Wine Press. And then, unfortunately or sadly, months later, Hillary asked me to write his obituary, which was terrible, just an awful thing. But we'd kid each other. He liked my cooking. He respected my palate. I respected his palate. He had a remarkable palate. We had distinct tastes. He's into a little bit bigger Pinots, but when he does them, they're great. I mean, I just had his 16 Adrian at that dinner, and I thought that was just wonderful. Just a wonderful wine. He's got another one that he made in an 11, where he kept it on lees for 2 years, and I have one bottle of that, which I'm still 11s I'm holding until they're 10 years old at least. But he would give me tastes along the way, and he noted that when I was really liking something, I would go, ooh. So that's an ooh wine, that 2011 Adrian. But, over the years, we became closer and closer. We would go back and forth on the 14s. The little comment that I would make in my writing, and I finally had to put it in print because people were stealing it. But my saying was, you date the 12s, you marry the 11s, you friend the 13s, and 14s are one-night stands, meaning I didn't expect them to last very long. So he and I would go back on that. He would say, no, because he was really proud of his 14 White Rose and 14 Winemakers Cuvée, which he thought would go for 10 years at least. No, 5 to 7. We started pouring the 14 White Rose, and the first time I tasted it was blind in an event, and I hated it. The stems were too apparent. And I told him, I told him and I told his brother, I said, needs time. He said, it's great wine, it's, one of the best things I ever made. It's fabulous. I mean, it's truly fabulous. And this is kind of sad, but when I visited him in the hospital, the only time I got to visit him, we were talking about it again, and they said, you're right, they are going to go longer. So at least I got to tell him that. But I mean, just to be working in there, I found out because I showed up at work, and Gavin, the general manager, I'm walking in from the parking lot, tells me, and I had no idea it had gotten that bad. We knew it wasn't good, but to where it happened. And so we're open. I mean, I asked him, we're going to stay open? He said, it's up to you guys. So I go in there, and my colleague Margot was in there, and he said, what do you want to do? And as we're talking, customers come in, so you just hunker down and go. There was there was so much potential, you know, and you know, we're still in mourning. It's tough to lose that talent and a friend. I mean, a really good friend.
So you wrote about the formation of what, like you said, what is now AHIVOY,
Yes.
and you got to attend their first fundraiser
Yes.
on Sunday. So tell me about the kind of what's going through your mind as you've watched it actually become something that is actually exists and has a name.
I was delighted. First of all, I really love the fact that folks don't sit around and whine with an H about the problems and, oh, woe is me, you know, people aren't getting ahead. They hunker down and do something. And I admire, you know, I'm second generation American on one side, third on the other. So I'm descended from immigrants. The Hulkowers came from Eastern Europe, and they worked their way up. And I admire that mentality. You know, there was a lot of families working together. And I also, you know, being of the academic persuasion, I like teaching. I like seeing people learn and develop and figure out what they want to do. So I was thrilled when I was there on Sunday night to see that it's gone from a no-name organization to a name to 501c3 status to a real plan involving taking at least a dozen folks from the vineyards, putting them in the classroom, and letting them figure out, you know, with skills, what they want to do next. I think that's just fabulous. So I pitched an article to Hillary for February. I haven't heard back, but I'm going to write it anyways. And I look forward to chronicling their success. I mean, it's a wonderful thing.
So to back up a little bit, you became interested in Oregon through its wine, and you kind of circled around it for a while, and you finally settled here. So tell me about your initial impressions of the Oregon wine industry before you got here, and then especially once you got here, and sort of how your impressions have changed.
So the first time I already told you about the first times I tasted Oregon Pinot. First time I set foot in Oregon was in 1990. There was a conference, aerospace conference that I went to, American Association of whatever. I don't do it anymore, so I don't remember the name. I'm not in the organization. But it was, you know, we decided, I mean, I'm in Oregon, and we went out for dinner one night to Jake's in Portland, and I had a bottle of, I can remember exactly what I had. I had a bottle of Rex Hill Pinot Gris, and we had a bottle of Adelsheim Pinot Noir. And I'm going, this stuff's really good. Yeah, want some. So after the conference, I was with a young lady who worked I was at MITRE at the time, worked in my department. And you know, why don't we just sort of go into wine country, not knowing what the heck we were doing. and so we got in the car, it's Friday afternoon, we're driving, maybe we can stop at Rex Hill and pick up some of this Pinot Gris, you know. And we driving down, and of course it's closed. I mean, I had never been to the Willamette Valley, Dundee, or anything else. So, okay, well, we got to eat. And I heard McMinnville's cool, so let's go to McMinnville. So we're driving through Dundee, and over on the side I see something that says Alfie's Wayside Inn. I said, that's really weird because Wayside Inn is in Sudbury, Massachusetts. We're in Oregon. What the heck? So we keep going. We get into McMinnville, and it looks like any other suburb, and there was no obvious place to eat. I had no idea about 3rd Street, Nick's, or anything else. So I said, you know what? Let's turn around and go back and eat at Alf's Wayside Inn. find out what that's all about. So we go in there, and it's not very crowded, and we get seated. And there's a wine list. There's a reserve wine list. And this is in 1990. There was a 1985 Cameron Reserve Chardonnay for $25. I said, you get that. And it was wonderful. The food was great too. Turns out the reason the place was called Alfie's Wayside Inn is because they had this cookbook that Vincent Price, the actor, assembled from recipes from all over the country, and one of them was Wayside Inn, and I think they took their dessert from that or something. So it's building up that Oregon is pretty damn good. So I'm back in Massachusetts, and we're getting, Oregon wines here and there. It wasn't until I actually, after Massachusetts, came to Washington State, where we started coming down and drinking more. So then it was much smaller, more intimate. There was no Chehalem tasting room. There was a trailer at the winery, and you bought your wines out of the trailer. Prices were lower, and there were fewer places to go to. Over time, certainly, even in the time between we bought our place 10 years ago, and now the changes are profound. There are way more wineries. You have this influx of, some Californians, Burgundians, and so on. The reputation has skyrocketed. Prices are both going up, and for the value segment, the number of offerings seems to be increasing, where the quality is good. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to mention any names, but it wasn't that long ago that I did a review of a book by the guy who was the, it'll come to me. He was the only reporter at the Judgment of Paris. I know him, he was in the Wine Economist for a little bit, but he did a book on bargain wines. His definition of bargain wines was under $15. You couldn't find anything in Oregon that was under $15 Pinot Noir wise that was worth drinking, and I commented on that in the book review. Are we there yet now? Maybe in the smaller formats, maybe, but certainly maybe in the $20 range. So over time, I think that's getting better. And at the same time, we now have, 3-digit Pinots. They're not uncommon. And they were rare back in the day. There's a whole, as I said, I'm in the Wine Economist, and I have an interest in that sort of stuff. I have concerns about pushing the prices up too high, too fast, if you're trying to capture a market. There's an excellent little article in Wine Business News today on that very point about, don't go for premiumization. Keep in mind the fact that you've got to bring in an audience. I'm an okay boomer, right? And we're kind of aging out. I'm actually an old boomer, and we're the ones who buy the expensive stuff because we can. My kids, who were variously millennials, and then there's a couple that are the one before that, the Gen Xers. They're in various phases, but they don't spend a lot on wine if they buy it at all. And then, the really younger millennials, you've got those issues. So I think the industry is going to, and I think it is responding to the fact that if you're going to attract more people, you have to have value offerings and then keep the prices sane. I understand that years of deprivation and not making any money and all that kind of stuff, the minute you get notice and so on, the temptation is there to pop up the price. But once you put it up there, you really can't bring it down. And without going into specifics, I have seen firsthand the effects of a price, a precipitous price rise, or a steep price rise, affecting the bottom line. Mm-hmm. I've seen it. It just happens, But reputation is fabulous. The wines are breathtaking. I've been to Burgundy with Scott Wright, who had founded Scott Paul. He's got that Caveau thing, and he tells you, only 10% of the Burgundy producers are any good, out of 3,000. He said the rest are coasting on reputation. I would flip that around and maybe make it 95, 5 that are excellent, and 5 that haven't figured it out yet. It's that good, it really is. It's a joy to be here,
What do you see as you look ahead for the industry? Obviously, you talk about precipitous change even in the last decade. Mm-hmm. What do you see a decade out in the future?
So I hope to be chronicling it then, and I expect that there's some things that are starting to happen now. There's this beginnings of a split between North and South. That has to be resolved, or it could become an issue. And I understand both sides of the argument. I really do. It's going to be hard for the first generation winemakers with no progeny to keep their businesses going. So there's going to be a lot more sales. Probably some consolidation. There's going to be some shaking out. Our economy, our economy is perceived to be good now, but everybody keeps thinking there's going to be a recession. The minute that happens, $100, $150 Pinots drop to the bottom of people's priority lists, and that'll happen overnight. There's already a backlog of high-end stuff. 14 was an abundant year, 15 was an abundant year, and those things are still available. So I think 17 was supposed to be pretty good in terms of quantities. So these backlogs have to sell out. Maybe production needs to reflect better what's going to be saleable, in a year or two. I think it's going to be a clash of, we made it on the world scene big time, undeniably, and economic reality, and how that's sorted out. If I could have a crystal ball, I'd be a lot richer. I could have figured out the recession and all this kind of stuff and made money that way. But somebody's going to have to, and I'm sure. I mean, the folks I meet, they're realistic, but they're also capitalizing on the fact that people come here, they pay the prices, at least for now.
You mentioned that Oregon wine kind of captured your interest personally from the very beginning, and especially Pinot Noir as a fan of Burgundy. So tell me, this many years later, is Pinot still that captivating to you? Do you still find it that exciting?
Okay, I can tell you, last night we had a bottle of 2008 Archery Summit Red Hills Vineyard that knocked my socks off. I didn't expect it. I love Red Hills. Eights to me have been mostly really good. I'm a cool vintage guy. It was a warm vintage. This had a quality from the time I opened it, through the time we finished it after dinner, that just made me happy. It's like I went back to some of the best Pinots that I've tasted from Oregon and gone, yes, and I got these in my cellar. It's great. I've got 2 more bottles. So I am somebody who's restless and curious and changes. I mean, I change jobs frequently for getting bored and for financial opportunities so I could buy even more wine and so on. But Oregon Pinot in general has just kept its hold on me. I hear, there was somebody who once said, "Oh, I get tired of Pinot." And I said, when you get tired of Pinot, you tire of life, I'm not tired of Pinot. I'm certainly not tired of life, No, they're wonderful, varied. Some are more to my palate than others. Oh, by the way, my palate changes. There was a time that I was into the big-ass reds, you get bitch slapped by fruit, whoom, yeah, hit me again. But I'm into elegance and understatement, savory, more savory Pinots, more complex, kaleidofactic, to use my word that nobody else ever does. That really, my sense of smell is still good, and I like to feed that. And there's no better wine than Pinot Noir, and Oregon makes some of the best. It just does.
So you mentioned that you hope to be chronicling Oregon wine for a while going forward.
Yep.
Other future plans? Anything else you're looking forward to on the horizon?
So this year I was recruited to be a field editor for Slow Wine 2020, which was a complete joy. I got to the sign-up sheet first, or one of the first, so I got to pick the wineries that were nominated. There were some 65 or so. And I cherry-picked those that I was interested in, some that I knew, some that I didn't know. And that's going to come out next year, and I hope that I get to do something like that again. I think I keep threatening to write a book, and I think I finally have to get off my butt and start doing it. So it'll be a project that I intend to keep working part-time and so on. And the book will, of course, mention my 2 loves, the wine and the math, not necessarily in that order, but maybe in that order. And so I have to make time to do that with fewer distractions on other writing assignments. But Hillary's got my email and say, hey, can you do this for me? And if I'm available, the answer is yes. We do travel a lot because we've got grandkids and kids in other states and so on. That takes time away. Somewhere down the line, I did have an article in the World of Fine Wines. I love British wine writers. They're my idols. When I first got into this interest, most of the wine writers were British. There were some Americans, certainly later on. Frank Pryl from the New York Times and Asher from Gourmet magazine, both marvelous writers. But then you had, the Brits. And even to this day, Andrew Jefford is fabulous. Hugh Johnson I enjoy. So it was a treat for me to be published in the same magazine that they publish in the World of Fine Wines. And another one that I'd really like to get an article in is Decanter, but they already have an Oregon guy, and I've pitched articles to them. It's tough getting anything sold. It really is, and so I have to try to come up with some idea that'll set me apart that they may bite on. They also will tell you we don't have big budgets. and we spent it all for this year, so you have to go back again, you know. So I'd like to get, you know, I'd like to reach out and get some stuff there. 75 looks like the 75 looks like an interesting publication. I've read some great articles in there, maybe there. In terms of ideas, again, I keep my ears open in the tasting room, and, you know, I take a lot of showers, so I get ideas that way, you know, just where they come. We'll see. We'll see. 10 years ago, I didn't know I was going to be doing this.
So if you had someone come up to you in the tasting room, say, and say they were a young person wanting to get into the wine industry today, what would your words of wisdom to them be?
Really want it, okay, because it's hard work, it's low pay. Depending on which end of the industry you get in, it can be long hours during harvest, and it's like anything else for anybody who wants to get into something, really want to do it and do it. So when I first started tasting wine, I had books, but I didn't read nearly as much about stuff as I do now. So I would say, certainly taste a lot of wines, develop your equipment, your palate, your nose. Read some, but do more tasting than not. Do internships, apprentice yourself to somebody in the wine industry, whatever aspect you're interested in. I mean, the wine industry is like any other industry. It's got a business side, it's got a technical side, it's got a sales side, it's got administrative side, and then it's got the publicity, the marketing, the ancillary stuff, you know. So pick where you want to go, try them all out, and just go for it. I mean, the key thing to anybody who really wants to do something is to get in there and start doing it. I mean, when I was first studying astronomy, and I was a kid, first of all, when I was in high school, I would hang out in the planetarium in Philly. When I was an undergrad, I got a job working for an astronomy professor under a NASA contract, and you know, it just gives you the experience. It tests your commitment to it. You know, do you really want to do this? Is this something you really want to do? Because then you see up front and you know, very personal what it is that you have to do if you're going to do this business. So same thing in the wine.
That's all the questions that I have for you today. Is there anything we didn't cover that we should have? Anything I didn't ask?
I think you did good. Thank you.
Well, coming from an interviewer and writer himself, that makes me happy. Thank you so much for joining us today, for giving us your thoughts and opinions, and we'll go ahead and sign you off.
Great.